Okay, so one of the very first things I like to do after I've launched Photoshop, after having just installed it, is I want to set it up so it's a little more conducive to the way I work. And that's going into and modifying the preferences. Now, if you are in fact brand new to Photoshop, you've never launched it before, you're probably going to want to work a little while or develop some habits when you're working in Photoshop and decide which preferences you want to turn on or off. But I just want to go through the preferences so you can perhaps notice some things you want to change right from the get-go, and you'll know where they are for future reference. Now, on a PC, the preferences for Photoshop are actually located under the Edit menu. Now, on a Mac, as we're working on now, they're located under the Photoshop menu. If you go here and then you see that there's the flyout menu and you have all your various preferences. You can access them individually, of course, or you can go right into the General or use the keyboard shortcut Command-K. And when we open this up, you'll notice it is a giant window. Now, all those different categories that were in the menu are also in the sidebar here, allowing us to access them all within this one window, and we can set it all up without having to go into each one individually. Now, this first one is the preferences, or the general preferences rather, and this is, as you'll notice, I'm just going to touch on a few of these. Some of the more pertinent ones that Photoshop users tend to go in here and modify. And the general preferences don't really need much changing unless there are some specific functions that you want to change. Notice there's a number of these that are checked on and off by default, and they're pretty self-explanatory. You can a couple of zoom features here. Up here at the top is some common features that get changed. If you're used to the color picker in your operating system, you can certainly choose that here. Here I can choose the Apple or the Adobe color picker. And you can set your image interpolation. This is also accessible inside your image size when you create a new document, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, the interface options allow you to modify the way Photoshop looks. Here are your screen modes, your various channel and panels. You can determine how they behave and how they view. You can set your languages down here. In the file handling, this is perhaps one of the more frequently visited areas because this determines how Photoshop deals with the files that you create. In the file saving options, you can actually determine how it's going to save a preview, if it's going to save a preview at all. In this case, I've got it set to always save. But you can choose never to save an image preview or ask when you're saving it. You can determine the platform it's going to be saved for, and you can also set it to append file extensions, which I always leave on because it makes it easier, of course, to determine what kind of file you're looking at on your desktop or in a folder or wherever. Now, down here in the file compatibility, we have a button to determine our camera raw preferences. If you are a photographer using camera raw, you can go in here and determine certain functions for all your camera raw files. You can determine your maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. This I've got set to ask. Sometimes I will set it to always. If you're going to be providing files from your version of Photoshop to users who are using earlier versions perhaps, or if you're using smart objects a lot, it will ask you to maximize compatibility depending on stuff you're doing, then you'll want to have this set to always. But depending on what kind of work you're doing, I would go ahead and leave it on ask. That way you can determine that at the time you're saving the file. It doesn't always do it automatically because you may set up file compatibility when it's not necessary to. So probably leaving it to ask is a good way to go. And here you can enable the version queue, and you can determine your recent files list, which under the file menu, if you go here and you see open recent, this will list the most previous files that you just worked on, and you can determine how many of those are listed in there. If you work on a lot of files, you can increase this number right in there. The next item here is performance. Here's where you determine how much of your RAM, your system's memory, is going to run your system, or how much is going to be allocated to Photoshop to function. And Photoshop is a RAM-hungry piece of software. It really does chew things up, especially if you're working on considerably larger files or a number of files at one time. You'll notice I've got 70% of my RAM allocated to Photoshop, and that's a fair chunk of RAM when you're working in here. Now, if you're working on relatively small files or you're working on web graphics, you can probably drop this number down considerably, but you want to make sure that depending on what type of work you're doing, this is where you'll set up how your RAM behaves with Photoshop. Here you have the history states, and this determines your undos. Basically, in a sense, you have unlimited undos in Photoshop. You can certainly set this number all the way up to 1,000 if you like, and if you have to undo something 1,000 times, and it's probably going to be easier to start over. The reason you want to keep this number relatively low, and we're going to talk about history a little later, where there's another lesson entirely dedicated to using the history, but you want to keep the number relatively low because every time you do something in Photoshop, in somewhere in your hard drive, Photoshop is going to save a version of that, just in case you have to refer back to it if you undo back to that. So it has to save that version somewhere. So setting this number very, very high will give you an unbelievable large file. So keeping that number relatively low is a good idea. GPO settings, you do want to enable your OpenGL drawing if your graphics card is capable. For some of the higher end graphics, perhaps if you're using Photoshop CS3 or CS4 extended, you want to have it for the 3D capabilities. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And just moving along, cursors, you can determine the behavior and, well, actually the appearance of your cursors. You can have it looking like the actual tool itself, precise, normal. Now, these are functions that will probably develop as you work in the program. I noticed over time that I would use precise, but I seem to like normal brush tip. And here, for the other cursors, I'm going to go ahead and put this on precise, so it gives me a target with a point, so I know exactly what I'm doing with that particular tool. Transparency and gamut determines when you have a file that has transparency and you have no other files layers beneath it. This is the grid you will see, and that basically represents a transparent area of your document. And you can change the size, colors, and all that stuff right within this window. Units and rulers determines your unit of measure. If you're working in inches, pixels, if you're working in video or web, this is your ideal measurement. Inches for print, and you got others, percentages, all those things are located right in here. And there's a quick and easy way to change your unit of measure while inside the document, and we'll show you that a little bit later on as well. Moving right along, we've got guides and grids, and we'll talk about guides and grids a little bit later, but this is where you would determine how those appear in your document. You have the ability to change the color, because depending on the document you're working on, your guides and grids may blend in, so you're going to have to change the color so you can make them more visible. Now, plugins basically determines if you have an extra plugins folder, you can go ahead and add it in here. Type, just as some very small type features. I've never really had to go in here and change anything. It's these top few that you're probably going to be finding yourself visiting the most. So that's the basic preferences, and I noticed I just changed a few, but as I mentioned, as you're working in Photoshop, you're probably going to discover some that you're going to want to go in here and change and do all that. So one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to preferences is the color preferences, or in this case, the color settings inside Photoshop. Now, under the Edit menu, we're going to go down here to Color Settings. Here's where you determine how Photoshop is going to display your images, what color space and what color profiles it's going to use to display the color images, and it's also going to determine when you bring in or import files into Photoshop, whether it's going to leave them as they are or convert them to your current color profile. Now, the settings here under general settings here, you notice it's set to North America General Purpose 2. Now, this is the default setting, and there was a time when Photoshop, long before digital photography really made it big and was being widely used, mostly Photoshop was being used for very small things like web graphics and stuff like that, mostly for images that were being displayed on a screen or a television set or something. And this one actually worked really well, but now that digital photography is getting much more prominent and much more widespread than it is, you're going to find that you want to change this to this one right here, which is North America Prepress 2. And notice what happened. A couple of things changed. It changed the RGB color space to RGB 1998. This is going to be the most commonly used color space. Now, you can go ahead and, if you have specific color profiles that you want to develop, you can also choose to load those. They would show up right in here inside your window. You could have a monitor color profile that you can certainly use. But I think you'll find that Adobe RGB is a good place to start, and you'll find that a lot of users use that as well. And these other settings for your other various color spaces will work just fine. Down here at the bottom, you have color management policies, and this is where it determines when you open a file that's been worked on by another person in another version of Photoshop, this is where you determine how it's going to behave. Notice that right now, if you open up an RGB, CMYK, or grayscale file, it's going to preserve the embedded profiles that are existing in that document. However, right here, you've got these items checked on, which are profile mismatches, and it's going to ask you when opening or when pasting if you want to embed that profile or convert it to the working profile that you're in now. So, again, these are going to be habits that you're going to develop over time working inside Photoshop. If you know for a fact you have specific profiles, this is where you would input those and then set them up for your various color spaces. But If you're completely new to Photoshop, as I mentioned, this is a very good place to start if you're going to be working with photographs, especially taken from a digital camera. So, those are the preferences and color settings. On the very next lesson, we're going to talk about the interface and the workspace in Photoshop so you can set it up to make it more conducive to the way you work as well. Alright, so now that we're familiar with the preferences inside Photoshop, let's look at the interface itself. And this is what we're looking at now. When you launch the program, this is what appears on your screen. So I just want to kind of go take a quick tour and break down all the various parts that we're looking at here. We're going to start at the very top here. And we have our various main menus. We have the File menu, Edit, Image, Layer, Select, Filter, Analysis, 3D. Now the analysis in 3D are only going to be appearing in Photoshop CS4 Extended. So if you do have that version of Photoshop, then you will also have these menus. If you have the standard version, these won't be here. Now, of course, we have the View and Window menus. Now, each one has its own properties. File determines a lot of the file behaviors and saving files and stuff like that, various edit features, and we're certainly going to cover these throughout the course, but I just want to give you an idea of what is where. The Image determines a lot of adjustments and various resolution and color spaces and things like that. That's where you determine. The Layer menu is very involved with all kinds of various options for managing your layers. Select menu determines and edits selections that you create. Filter menu, this is a whole lesson in and of itself. Filters are very involved effects that you can apply to your images to enhance them, create visual effects, do illustrated effects, various things like that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the course. The analysis is for medical professionals where they can determine and set up various measurements for medically based images like DICOM and such like that. But unless you're a medical professional, this really isn't relevant. So we're going to move right along to the 3D. Again, this 3D feature is only available in Photoshop CS4, but unlike the previous version of CS3, 3D is a bit more involved now. They did introduce Photoshop or 3D in Photoshop CS3, and if you've used that version at all, you'll notice that the 3D features were very limited. But now in Photoshop CS4, we have considerable number of new tools for working with 3D. The View menu determines how your images are viewed inside Photoshop. You can do the zooming, set up your screen modes, and show guides, grids, everything like that. The Window menu opens up all the various panels that are located in Photoshop. And you'll notice by default, a couple of them are already on. Panels that are on, or anything that's active, will have a check mark next to it, as you can see right here. So the color panel is open, the layers, the application frame. So all these various windows are open. And to open any panel that isn't open, just simply select it. So if I go in here and choose Actions, you'll see that it pops up. Now notice what it did. It popped out of what it's called a group, a tab group. So jumping right along, we're going to talk about panels now, is that you'll notice all these panels are tabbed. So you can click on each tab and it will open up that particular panel. Some of these panels are grouped and you're able to detach them out of their existing group. So if I just grab this in this open area here and drag it out to my document, it basically removes it from the dock and is now a free-floating panel. You can still access each one of these panels. You can even remove panels from their existing panel groups and make them individual panels. You can also minimize these down to icons by clicking these small little arrows in the top, just like that, to minimize the area that the panel occupies. It still keeps the panel open, but it minimizes your screen area so you can work a little bit better. And to access them, you simply click on it. It opens up temporarily, and you just click the arrow and it pops back in. And all these can be redocked right back into your panels just by dragging it over, and you see it highlights at the bottom there indicating that it's about to be docked in there, and there you have it. And just simply minimize that. So it's a quick and easy way of managing how the panels can be grouped, ungrouped, moved around, everything like that. Now, you got a similar thing going on with your documents. Now, you'll notice I've got an image open here, and this is something new to CS4. If you've used previous versions, this is something a little different. Like the tabs, similar to the way the tabs work in your panels, you also have tabs in your documents. So I've got two documents open here, and just by simply clicking on one, it will open that particular document. Going back over here, jumping back in between them. Now, if I want to rearrange the order here, I can simply drag this over, and you'll see that they switch places. So if you have more than two documents, if you've got 5, 6, 7 documents, you can rearrange them similar to the way you rearrange panels. You do the same thing over here. You just drag and move the panels around. So it's a good thing to know that you can do this with panels because you're probably not going to use every panel. depending on what kind of work you do in Photoshop. You may be a photographer, you may be a 3D artist, you may be a video professional. Now, if you are, this is where the concept of workspaces comes into play. Now, what is a workspace? Well, workspace is if you go into the window menu and you go into this menu right here and you see we've got workspaces. A workspace is basically an arrangement of your interface. Basically, you can set up panels, put them in particular positions. You can even set up keyboard shortcuts and various things like that, and then save that workspace so you can bring it back whenever you need it if you're going to work in a specific field. Now, Photoshop has come pre-packaged with a number of workspaces that are conducive to specific workflows. If you go into the window menu and you go to that flyout menu, you'll notice right now we're working in the Essentials default workspace. And I did move some stuff around, so if I reselect this, it's going to rearrange those panels back to the way they were. So now we're back to the original default workspace. But under that workspace menu, we have other things. You have the very basic functions, which it basically... Now, here's the thing. If you're accessing workspaces for the first time, it's going to give you this. The selected workspace will modify menu and or keyboard shortcuts. We'll go ahead and hit yes. And it will take us to a very basic workspace. As you can see right here, it's basically minimized all the panels. They're still open, but it's given us more screen area, and all we have to do is click on each one to open it up. Other workspaces available are, here's a very good one. Again, if you're brand new to Photoshop, or if you're not new, you've worked on previous versions, and you want to have a look at what's new in CS4, simply highlight that. And I'm going to go ahead and tell this not to show me this again. Let's go ahead and click yes. What this does is it highlights all the new features in your menus and all things like that. So everything that's highlighted blue is something new inside this version of Photoshop. And they've done this with the previous versions of Photoshop. So what's new in CS3 has got it, various things like that. And just below that, we've got a number of categories for different types of workflows. Let's say if you're a 3D artist, you can choose the 3D workspace, and it will bring up the 3D panel, as you can see. It's got the layers panel. And you have workspaces for painting, analysis, color and tone if you're doing color correction on a number of different photographs. So these are quick and easy ways to get used to. There's a video workspace, which brings up the animation panel. So as I mentioned, these are pre-packaged workspaces that are available right away inside Photoshop. So if you go in here into the workspace, and you'll notice you have another option down here at the bottom called Save Workspace. As I mentioned earlier, we can go in here and decide, open up certain panels and rearrange them however we want to do it. And then we have the option of saving that workspace as our own. And that will show up also inside the workspace menu here after you've saved it. You can also delete your workspaces as well. So instead of having a lot of unnecessary panels open or certain things functioning that you don't really need depending on what you're doing in Photoshop, this is a good way to manage that and to be able to access it. Now, another way of accessing it is inside the application frame. Up here in the top corner, you've got this quick little window to quickly access all those various workspaces that we could just we're just able to get into. Now, a couple more things I want to talk about the interface. Now, this is the toolbar over here on the side. I did forget to mention that, but on the next lesson, I'm actually going to talk about the tools and the tools options a little bit more in detail. But I just want to show you that this toolbar, again, like the panels, can be moved and drag out. You can also, if you remember from earlier versions of Photoshop, if you've used them before, it had a double column toolbar, which you can still do. If you click this little arrow, it'll actually bring your toolbar into a two-column scenario. So depending on the size of your screen, or if you're just like working in this particular way, you can do that. They did go ahead and make it a single column, again, to give you more screen space for your images. Now, all the various tools and their options are located in the options bar, appropriately enough, at top. Notice when you select the tool, it changes up there. But again, as I mentioned, we're going to get more in depth on the tools and their options in the next lesson. Now, one last thing I want to show inside Photoshop CS4, and this is something brand new. Now, if you've been working in Photoshop on a PC for some time, then this will be nothing new to you. But new to the Mac version of Photoshop, in fact, I'm going to take my workspace back to the Essentials. New to the Mac version of Photoshop is something called an application frame. Under the window menu down here, you can see it's checked on. What it is basically is it contains the entire application in a single window. So if I go over here down to the bottom and grab the corner and resize it, you can notice that everything stays contained in one convenient window. So I can resize this for the purposes of recording, like I'm doing right now. It makes it easier to consolidate everything into one simple window that I can resize and not have a bunch of scattered panels everywhere. The beauty of this inside the Mac version of Photoshop is that it's optional. If you go into the window menu, you can down here and turn it off. By unchecking that, now we're back to the way Photoshop was once before, where we just have we can see our desktop right behind the windows, and everything looks great. This is actually the way I like to work. I'm not a big fan of the application frame, but in certain circumstances, it can be a big help. So, there's a quick overview of the entire interface of Photoshop and how you access certain functions. And we're going to be using these features throughout the rest of the course, but I just wanted to give you a quick little here's where this is located type of thing. Now, in the next lesson, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the tools and the toolbar and the options that go with it. All right, moving right along now, we're going to talk about the toolbar inside Photoshop and the various options that go with it a little bit more in depth. Now, with the toolbar, it's probably going to be the most visited panel. In fact, I have no doubt it's going to be the most visited panel in your Photoshop workflow because this is where you access everything. Even the tools that correspond to other panels are going to be located in the toolbar, so you're going to have to select them in here. Now, with regard to the toolbar itself, you can, as I mentioned in the last lesson, you can grab it and drag it outside the workflow or outside the application frame. And you can certainly click on the very top here and turn it into a double column toolbar if you like working that way. You certainly have that option. And I just want to kind of go down the list here and just kind of go through each of the various tools that we have. But I want to point out a couple of characteristics about the toolbar as a whole. Notice every tool, as you hover over it, highlights a tool, of course. Now, notice every tool has this little tiny, in fact, let me just kind of jump right in here and zoom. It's got a little tiny black dot or a black triangle at the corner there. What that indicates is that there are more tools located within this tool. So by simply clicking a tool and holding, it will plop out a menu that will show you the various tools located in there. This is basically their tool groups. So you just don't have the tool that you see in the toolbar. You've got various tools that are in addition to that. So just by clicking and holding, you can access various other tools like that. Now this top tool is, of course, the Move tool. So by selecting that, you can grab an object in your document and move it around. The second item is your Selection tools, which gives you very defined selections like rectangular shapes, elliptical or rounded shapes, single rows, vertical and horizontal. And you have your Drawing Selection tools, which is your Lasso tool, which if you take it, allows you to just draw very loose selections. You've got Magic Wand and Quick Selection tools, which makes selections based on a range of tolerances, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but just to show you an idea, take that Magic Wand tool. If the circle is all black and I click right in there, because it's all one unified color, it's going to select the entire shape. If it were made up of a number of different colors, then it would have selected that based on a range and not gotten the entire thing. And you have your Crop tool for cropping images, slicing for web graphics and such like that. Eyedropper tool allows you to sample colors, and you can plot down counts and rulers and everything like that. The healing tools allow you to do a lot of really quick retouching. You've got spot healing, healing brush, patch tool, and the red eye tool, of course. Red eye is a common problem in a lot of digital photos. We'll get into these healing tools a little bit later in the course, but that is where they are located. Various brush tools. The clone tool, which allows you to sample one area of an image and repaint it on another area of your image. History brush, eraser tools, gradient tools, very, very common tool used inside Photoshop. And notice when I'm selecting each one of these tools is what's happening up here. All the various options that you have for your individual tools are all in this options bar right here. So every time you select a different tool, a new set of options appears. Now, a lot of the options are very common and amongst all the other tools. So you'll see that you can access brushes, sizes, and things like that, but they're all going to have very specific functions for each tool as well. And moving on down the list here, we've got our dodge and burn tools for adjusting photographs. Blur, sharpen, smudge tools. The pen tool is a very good tool for generating selections. Of course, the text tool, and you've got various text tools. Your standard horizontal type tool, vertical type, and horizontal and vertical mask tools. Path selection tools, you have vector shapes as well. You can actually generate vector-based shapes, and we'll get into these a little bit later, but these are just various shapes you can create. And we have our 3D manipulation tools. Again, these are only available in Photoshop CS4 Extended. So if you have that version, you will be able to access these tools as well. We've got the hand tool and zoom tools for navigating around your document, zooming in and out, various things like that. And at the very bottom of the toolbar here, you have, let's just kind of zoom in here and we'll talk about that. you have your foreground and background color swatches. These are going to be used a lot. These are the current colors that are going to be used by a number of filters, your paintbrushes and things like that. You can access changing those colors just by clicking right on it. So let me zoom back out here. Notice when I clicked on it, it opened up the color picker, which allows me to change and modify my colors. Talk about that a little bit later. So foreground and background colors. This tiny little icon right here is actually the default setting. So if I go in here and I've got a color set to that, if I want to return to my default black and white, you can simply click right on that icon and it will go back there. And you can flip around or basically switch your foreground and background colors just by clicking this little bent arrow here, and that just flops them around like that. And the very last icon at the bottom of the toolbar is your quick mask mode, and that's a selection tool, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in the selections lessons a little bit later in this course. So as I mentioned, we've got our various tools, we've got our options that appear up in our toolbar that we can modify it and change the various aspects of these tools to make them do what we need them to do. And just remember that those tools, all the ones that have these little tiny icons here, have a number of tools that you can access within them. Just like that. So one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to toolbars and option bars is something new to CS4. At the very top here we've got our application bar. And this is a way of accessing a number of features that you're probably going to find you're going to need to get to when you're working inside Photoshop. Here we have a quick access to the bridge. You can access your various guides and grids to show them, show rulers, various things like that. Here's your percentages for your zoom. So if you're not using the zoom tool, you can actually input a percentage and it will display your document accordingly. You can quickly access the hand tools, and it's the same hand tool in the toolbar down here, just a quick way of getting it there. Now, here is a new feature that I didn't show in the last lesson, but I just wanted to touch on it here. It's the canvas rotation tool. And if you're an artist, or perhaps you're working on a Cintiq or some kind of display where it's not really easy to turn the whole device, and you don't necessarily want to rotate your document, you can rotate the canvas. Now, what I mean by rotating the document is by just completely taking it and redrawing the pixels by rotating it 90 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise or such. With the canvas rotation tool, you're simply taking it and basically repositioning it as if you were setting a piece of paper on a table and you slightly turned it at an angle so you could write or draw at a certain angle and something like that. Same principle here. So notice when let's go back in here and reset the view. So just to give you an idea, if I take the rectangular selection tool and just draw a box, so notice it keeps it a square, it's got up and down, left to right lines. If we take that canvas rotation and give us a slight turn, that is going to know that. So I'm still drawing a rectangular selection. It looks angled because we've turned our canvas. So it's not redrawing the pixels or rotating your artwork. It's simply rotating your view of the artwork. You can always go back into that feature and just click Reset View, and it brings you back to your original setting. The last couple things, you've got tiling settings, which means if you've got multiple files open, you can go in here and just quickly select this, and let's go ahead and do this one right here. We'll do a 3-up. And what it will do is display all my open images in 3 columns like this. So if you've got 3 or more images open, you want to get a quick look at them, maybe even compare side to side on a particular image, this is where you would access that to bring them up. So you maybe want to do a 2 by, and you want to compare the 2 images next to each other. That's how you would do that, and you can always go back to your single frame view. Last item is your screen mode, and this determines if you want to do a quick display. So right now we're in standard screen mode, which is what we're looking at now. If you go to full screen mode with menu bars, it will basically fill your entire monitor with your Photoshop interface. And notice the background here, it's completely filled with the default gray color. If you remember in the preferences, you can change that. But it's also left the toolbar and all the panels visible. That last item, full screen mode, basically will render your screen black, only showing your image that you're working on inside your Photoshop interface. It'll hide all the panels and do all that stuff too. Now, another way of doing this or toggling through screen mode is simply pressing the letter F on your keyboard. So I'm going to press that again, and it will bring me back to my standard mode. So, quick and easy way of getting to your tools, getting to the options, moving around your document. Now, speaking of moving around your document, what I want to do in the next lesson is talk about just that, getting around, how you can move around, drag and drop between documents, moving around your various panels and open documents so you get a little bit more easier workflow there. Alright, now in this lesson we're going to talk a little bit more about the interface in the sense that how to get around your documents and navigate through them, either through multiple documents or with a single document. And we're going to start by talking about the zoom features. Now there have been some enhancements to the zoom tools inside Photoshop CS4. If you're coming from previous versions, you'll appreciate these. And there are some of the older features that are also still there. So in the toolbar, I'm going to go down here, I'm going to select my zoom tool. And one thing right off the bat, if you click on the zoom tool, actually clicking on it once will select it. But if you double click it, notice my image right now is at 50%. It says it right here in the title, and it's also right here in my zoom level. If I double click on it, it's going to bring it to 100%. Now, this is a relatively high-res file, so it made it really big in my document. And you can see it's 100% here, it's 100% there. So double clicking on the zoom tool is certainly one way of zooming in and out. Another way is a popular keyboard shortcut I like to use, which is the command key. That would be the control key on a PC, and then the plus and minus keys. So if I control or command minus, it will actually zoom it out in steps. Now one very cool thing about the tool is I've got the zoom tool selected. If I click on this image and hold, it'll actually zoom in real time, almost as if it were like a video. It's actually got fluid zooming in and out. And if I add the space bar, if I actually just hold down the space bar with my document, it turns into the hand tool temporarily and allows me to move around my document. So if I just move this around, and another new thing with Photoshop CS4 is that it's smooth. If you have an iPhone, you'll be familiar with this feature. If I just click and drag, it's got fluid movement. Actually, the slides like that. It's a very cool feature. Now again, I'm going to hold down my zoom key a little bit and go in a little bit closer, and after it goes past 600% magnification, you actually get a grid here. This is a pixel grid. It basically outlines the individual pixels that make up your image. So you can see we're really close in here. We're at 810%, and we can see the individual pixels in there. Now, to zoom out using the tool, I'm going to hold down the Option key. That would be the Alt key in a PC, and you can see that the tool changes from a plus to a minus. So if I click and hold, it'll actually zoom back out of the document. Really fluid like that. And it pops right back into place. And I'm just going to press Command plus to bring it back to 50%. So it's a quick and easy way to zoom in and out of your document. And when I'm at 100%, I'm going to double click that tool. And again, I showed you can move around with the hand tool to get to very specific parts if you're working very close in on your document. And another way of managing the magnification of your image is up here in the Options bar. When you've got the zoom tool selected, you notice you got a number of different features here. You can actually choose whether it's going to zoom in and out right in here, or again, you can use that keyboard shortcut, Option or Alt. You can resize the windows to fit. Zoom all windows. You can set it. These are various buttons here for specific functions. You can do actual pixels, which is the same as doing 100%, like double clicking on the zoom tool as you saw. You've got the fit screen, which will make it fit your currently open document area. As you can see right there, it popped it right in there so we can see the whole thing. Fill screen, again, fills up your entire open screen area. Fit screen basically looks at the dimensions of your images and it does its best to fit it in there, make it all visible. Notice we got some open area on the sides. That's where fill screen goes in. Notice it cropped out some of the top and bottom, but it did fill in the entire open area there. And print size, of course, shows you what its dimensions is currently set at. If we go into the image menu and go to image size, you'll notice that it's relatively high res, 300 pixels per inch, and we'll get a little bit more in depth with resolution in a later lesson, but I just wanted you to see. It's got a relatively high resolution, but low dimensions. It's only 5 inches, or just over 5 inches by 3 inches. So it's very, very small. So showing it at print size is going to make it look very small. It's still very high res, but it's very small on my screen. Let's go ahead and go back to actual size. So it's a quick and easy way of zooming in and out and managing how you zoom in and out of your document. Now another way of doing that, and this is an older feature, if you go under the window menu and open up the navigator right here, and let's just drag that out of the panels there so we can see, and we'll close that group there. The navigator allows you to do very similar things just in a separate window. Notice we've got a mini version of our file, and this red outline indicates this currently visible area. And by grabbing that and moving around, we can actually navigate around our document a little bit better. And you can use this slider to zoom in and out. Enter a specific percentage if you like. We'll do 25%. And now we have that. So the navigator is another panel to open with the way they've set up the new features now, where you can just zoom in and out fluidly if you hold the tool down. Makes it a lot easier in your workflow. Now, one quick thing about navigating around the document is working between other documents. So you notice I've got a number of different files open here. If I wanted to drag and drop in previous versions, let me go into the window menu and actually turn off the application frame. In previous versions, this is what we would see. Especially on a Mac, you would see the various documents all stacked on top of each other. And to drag and drop one image into another, you would simply just grab it with the Move tool and then drag it into the target document, and it plops right in there. Now, if you are in your application frame and you've got all these tabbed documents, it's a little more difficult because you're only seeing one image at a time. So if I wanted to, for instance, take that image that we had and drag it to another file, I would simply grab it and then drag it up to that name, and it will open up that file, and then you just move down and release, and it will drag and drop that file in there. So it's a quick and easy way of dragging and dropping between files when you're working in the application mode with all the tabbed documents. Now, one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to moving around your documents is, as I mentioned in the earlier lesson, we were talking about the tiling modes here. And if we wanted to compare other images with other various open documents with the others. And so let's go, for instance, and do the 3-up, since we have 3 documents open, just like this. So if I double click my zoom tool, it's only going to zoom in on my currently active document. However, if I hold down my shift key and I double click that zoom tool, it's going to bring all the other files to the same magnification. Now, because this image is considerably higher res than these other two, it looks a lot bigger on the window there. So let's go over here and we'll move these into place. So let's just go ahead and zoom into these individually so we fill our screen. Now, if I wanted to compare certain parts of these images together and I want to maneuver around, if I select an image and hold down my space bar to access my hand tool and just move this, it'll move the one image. But if you hold down the space bar and the shift key, you'll notice it will move all of the windows at the same time, allowing you to move specific parts. If you're working on 2 images simultaneously, in fact, let me do this. Let's go ahead and close these. And with this image here, I'm going to go ahead and go under Image and go to Duplicate. And what it's going to do is create an exact copy of this file. And you'll notice there. And let's just do a quick adjustment to this. Let's just go ahead and make it darker. And I'm going to go into my mode or image menu and go to Adjustments. And let's just do the brightness and contrast. And I'm just going to make a really silly change so you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just going to increase the contrast and drop the brightness to make it a little bit more dramatic. So now I want to see the before and after of that. So let's go into that tile mode and bring a 2 up here. And let's hold down that shift key and double click that space bar. And now I'm going to hold down the space bar and the shift key and maneuver these at the same time so I can compare them. I can maneuver around the document and compare various parts right next to each other there. So it's allowing me to get around and move those to see what I want to see without a lot of complicated going in here and then moving this one around and then making this one at the same time. So, really easy way of moving between documents, being able to compare documents, and zooming in and out to get a little closer look at it. So, keys here are the zoom tools, the zoom features, being able to zoom in and out, using those command keys, command minus, command plus. Simply clicking and holding on that zoom tool will zoom it in, and having that hand tool to move around the document when you're really close in there. So these are key features that you're going to find very useful when you start working a little bit more in depth with larger images or even multiple images. So now we're going to jump over to the next lesson where we're going to talk about history, going back in time. And you remember when we were talking about the preferences earlier, we had our history states that we can input. So I want to talk a little bit more in depth about history and the various options you have with that. Alright, so now I like to call this lesson going back in time because Photoshop allows you to basically do that. Go back in time and fix something that you didn't mean to do. How cool would it be if we could do that in real life? But it's basically done through the use of history. And some will call it multiple undos inside Photoshop, but when you're talking about using the history panel and history options inside Photoshop, it's a lot more to it than that. Because you can not only go back to a state that you were in before, You can also bring back just a part of something. Maybe you did something earlier and you just want to bring back part of that. You could certainly do that. So let's talk first about history in general. Now, if you remember from the first lesson talking about preferences, if we go in there and go into the performance, here we've got the history states. And right now the default number is set to 20. And as I mentioned, you want to keep this number relatively low unless you have a massively just unbelievable system with an unbelievable amount of RAM and hard disk space. Then you can increase this number. As you saw, you can go ahead and increase it up to 1,000. But I mentioned keeping that number relatively low because every time you do something in Photoshop, it's going to save it as a version of that. So if you apply a filter, you've applied a correction, it's going to remember that. It's going to record that you did that and have that referenced. So if you need to go back to that, it's going to be able to do that. Now, when it does that, it's got to save it somewhere, and it's going to save it on your hard disk space. So imagine it this way. If I've done 30 things to my document, or 20 things in this case, then I've got basically 20 versions of that file somewhere sitting around my hard drive taking up space. So you can imagine if I had to set up to 100 or even 500, that's a lot of work. Now, granted, there's going to be projects where you're going to want an unbelievable number or an infinite number of undos just in case you need to go back. But for general purposes, I've discovered that keeping it around 20 or 30 works relatively well, especially if you've got a pretty good speed on the system. So let's keep that number there. So history, basically it's undos. As I said, virtually unlimited undos. So when you do something inside Photoshop, you go under the image or the edit menu and you go here to undo. And you can see the last thing I did on this particular image was undo, or I flattened the image. So if I wanted to undo that, I would simply select that in the menu. Or if I wanted to redo it, you can go up here and notice what we've got here. We've got the Command Z, which is the first item, which is the undo. Basically undoes what you just did. If you use the same keyboard shortcut or select the same item, it's going to redo what you just undid. So that's all that does. Now, here you have step forward and step backward. So what does that mean? Basically, that means exactly what I was talking about earlier, stepping forward or backward in time. And what it's referencing is your history states. Now, if you go to the window menu and go down here to history, and it's going to open up the history panel. And this will show you everything I've done to this document up till now. Now, as you saw, my history states were set to 20. So if I do 30 things to my item, it's going to forget or basically toss out the first 10 things I did. So it's only going to remember the last 20 things I do to my document. And here you can see all the things that I've done. Now, here we have a snapshot. So by selecting that, it's basically bringing me back to my original document. This is what it looked like when I first opened it. And this is what it looks like after I've done all the various effects I applied to it. And these are all the steps in between. So if I know that I want to go back to the very beginning, I can just select that state and boom, there I am. However, if I'm at that place where I flatten the image and I want to go back to when I did this grain filter here, then it will take me back to that state. And I can continue working from there. Now, if I go back to this state and I apply a new effect, if I go in here and let's perhaps do a blur, so we'll do a Gaussian blur, click OK. Notice what it did. It erased all those other states and now has started a new path. Basically, you can look at it as like a timeline. We erased that timeline at this point in time and started a new one. So now it's going to continue on from here. So I'm just going to Command Z to undo that, and now we've got all those other previous states. So that's how I can jump around to each previous state. So what happens if I want to basically bring back a part of my image? I don't necessarily want to go back to a particular state, but maybe I want to bring back the surfer as it was in the original file. Well, that's going to be involving something called the history brush. Now, the history brush is located in the toolbar. It's, of course, a brush. It's right here. If you click and hold, you've got the history brush and the art history brush. So let's talk about the history brush itself. Works just like a brush inside Photoshop. Now, we do have a chapter on brushes we're going to talk about. But if I select the history brush, and notice right here that my history brush icon is selected on. It's on the original state of my image. Now if I wanted to maybe just bring back the blending change I made here, or maybe I applied this cutout filter, maybe I want to bring that back into play. Anywhere I put this history brush icon, it's going to bring back that state when I paint. So just to show you an idea, I'm going to select the original state of this document and go into there and just start painting. And notice what it's doing. It's bringing back the original image right inside there. But it's giving me the ability to leave the rest of the effects I applied to this image in place. So it's basically, I'm still at this state here. Notice it's recording my history adjustments that I'm doing here. So it's recording every step I do, but it's referencing this original file. So it's keeping all my effects in place, and we're able to do that. Now, that's bringing back using the basic history brush. Now, the art history brush works a little differently. And a good way to think about the history brush tool is just undo on a brush. You want to undo very specific parts of your images and not necessarily undo something you did on the entire image. That's just what it is. It's undo on a brush. Now, the art history brush works a little differently in that it still references a history state inside your image, but it does it in a kind of painterly fashion. Notice the options we've got up here. We've got various different, and I honestly can't tell you what each one of these do. It's really going to depend on the image, and you select it and experiment and see what it does. But just to give you an idea, if I select a certain feature and just start painting back, it's referencing a history state, but painting it in a very kind of painterly fashion, you see, and hence the name art history, or art history brush, rather. So it brings it back, and it gives me a very unique effect. So, you know, with a little bit of experimentation, you can come up with some very unique techniques there. But that's the art brush and the art history brush. Now, going back in here, I want to talk about the history panel a little bit more. This is basically a snapshot of our original document on what we created. So by referencing this snapshot, we can go back to the way our original file originally was. But let's say I've gotten to this point here. Let's undo. Now, to commit multiple undos really quickly, notice if you go under the Edit menu and do an undo state change, but here, if you select it again, it's going to redo the state change. So it's just going to keep going back and forth. But to keep going up the history panel into those undos, and using the keyboard shortcut, if you hold down the Option or Alt key on a, well, it's the Alt key on a PC and an Option key on a Mac, and I'm going to hold down the Command key, it will be Control key on a PC, and then continuously press the Z key, it does the same thing. It does those multiple undos up until you see the point you want to stop. It's the same thing as going under the Edit menu and doing step backward. So we'll hit step backward, and it's doing the same thing again, step backward. So it's the exact same thing, just using the keyboard shortcut gets you there a little bit faster. Now, one thing I want to talk about is a snapshot here. So let's say I've gotten to this point in my image. I'm going to go into the flyout menu here, and I'm going to choose New Snapshot. Full document. So now I have two snapshots to refer to. I've got this version and this version. So no matter what I do in the history panel now, if I go and do a number of different items or apply a number of different effects and even do so many that I lose a lot of these history states because I keep adding them, stacking them on, I have now saved a version that I can always bring back. So if I wanted to, so if I'm at this point in my history panel and I want to bring back parts of this image, simply highlight that and we'll get our history brush and just bring that right back in. So we're isolating that correction. So not only is it going to, by default, save a snapshot of the image once you open it. So it's your original document. This is how it looks when I opened it. But when you get to a certain point of applying certain effects, go in here and create a snapshot. There's also a quick keyboard or the quick button right down here that goes ahead and creates a snapshot as well. So creating a snapshot allows you to basically save the version you're at and always be able to refer to it later. Because you're going to continue to apply effects, and those history states are going to pile up. You're going to lose them, as I mentioned. So saving a snapshot allows you to always go back to that version anytime you want. It's a little easier. In fact, it's way easier than duplicating your document and saving that version. It keeps it all conveniently in one simple document. So, real easy way to go back in time, bring back parts of your image, or bring back the whole image that you started with, all using the history. Alright, so in this lesson we're going to talk about two very important aspects when you're working with any digital file inside Photoshop, and that is image size and color space, or color mode of your documents. Now, right away when you have an open document like this, there are a couple of indicators that tell you a little bit about your file. Notice in the title bar right here, we've got of course, the name of our file, and we are at the current magnification of 50%. And inside the parenthesis here, it tells us that our color space is RGB, and we're at 8 bits per channel, so it's our bit depth and our color space. Furthermore, you have information down here at the bottom. If you go down here, you can see in this little area that we have the file size, which is currently 5.49 megabytes. And if you click and hold on that, you'll notice it gives us a little bit more information. Here we have our pixel dimensions of 1700 by 1129 pixels. Again, RGB color space, 8 bits per channel, at 300 pixels per inch. So, to be able to modify this information, go up here to the image menu, go down to image size, and inside this dialog you'll notice we have that same information with some new information that we can all change and modify. Notice in this first section that we have the pixel dimensions. Again, we see that we have a 5.49 megabyte file. And there's our pixel dimensions right here, and we also have our document size, which is 5.667 inches by 3.763 inches. Now these unit of measures can be changed just by going into these menus, and you notice we have various ones. Inches is going to be the most common, but you'll notice that pixels will probably be more relevant to people working in video or web. So what do all these numbers mean? Well, the pixel dimensions is a result of this calculation here. You can see that our resolution of our document is 300 pixels per inch. So every inch of our document contains 300 pixels by 300 pixels, which makes this a relatively high-res file. And this number, 300 times this width here, which is 5.667, equals our pixel dimension of 1700. The same for the height. This number times this number equals this. So what if we wanted to resize this file? Well, if I go up here into the pixel dimensions and highlight the width of 1700, and let's say I input 1000, you'll notice some things changed. Well, right away you can see that our file size has dropped dramatically. You notice it was 5.5 megabytes, and it's gone down to 1.9 megabytes. And our dimensions, you notice the height changed in proportion to our width when we modified that. And that's because of the locked proportions here, and that's because of this setting down here. You can see the constrained proportions is turned on. By unchecking that, you can see that it does unlock it, and we would be able to modify each of those independently. However, to keep your images in proportion, you will want to go ahead and leave that checked on. So again, back to where we were. If I drop that to 1000, you'll notice also that the dimensions of the document changed. They went down considerably to 3.3, down to, and the height down to 2.214. But our resolution has been unchanged. But when we want to reduce the file size of our documents, in doing it this way, you'll notice that because the file size has dropped dramatically, we've basically thrown out information. We threw out detail. We threw out some pixel information, which is going to dramatically drop the quality of our document. Now, if you want to be able to maintain the current resolution of your document, but yet reduce the dimensions, one thing you want to do, now I'm going to go ahead and reset my settings, and if you just simply hold down the Option or Alt key, you can see that the Cancel button turns into a Reset button, so you can quickly reset to back to your original settings. So now I'm going to change one thing. You'll notice down here there's a checkbox for resampling image, and now resampling is simply a way that Photoshop redraws your image in a sense. So when I dropped down these pixel dimensions to 1000, it threw out that information. So reducing the file size that way will not damage the file too much because you're making it smaller. But making the file size much bigger, which I'll talk about in just a moment, will degrade the quality of your image. But let's say you wanted to keep your pixel dimensions of 1700 1129. Well, if I uncheck resample images, notice what happens. It has completely grayed out my pixel dimensions, making it unable for me to modify them. But I can still modify my dimensions here and the resolution. So notice what happens. Let's say I wanted to make this a 10-inch file. You'll notice what happened. When I did that, my pixel dimensions remain unchanged as well as the file size, but the resolution dropped. So a quick and easy way to remember this, when you have resampling checked off, when you increase your pixel or your document dimensions, you are reducing the resolution. And vice versa, if you increase resolution, let's say I take this and go really dramatically up. Let's say we go with 600. Notice our pixel dimensions remain unchanged and the dimensions have dropped considerably. So if you want to maintain the current resolution or current pixel dimensions of your image, simply uncheck the resample and you can resize your document and everything will stay the same. Notice now you can use these scrubby sliders, and I haven't mentioned these yet. Anytime you're inside of a setting, you can drag over a name like this, you'll notice, and there's a little hand with the little double arrows, and it allows you to quickly scrub through your numbers. So notice when I'm dragging the width and I'm going considerably higher and higher, notice what's happening to the resolution. It's going down and down. And that's simply because it's maintaining this pixel dimension. Conversely, if I take that resolution considerably higher, once again, pixel dimensions are dropping. So, Quick and easy way of resampling your image. Now I just want to show, now this is a high-res file, as you remember. You can see it was 300 pixels. What happens if you increase the size of your document? Well, here I have a relatively low-res file. If we go under image size, you'll notice that this one is only 6 by 4 inches at 75 pixels per inch. And the pixel dimensions are 450 by 300. It's a very small file size, 395.5. So as I mentioned earlier, what happens if you pump in more pixels? Well, I'm going to keep the resampling checked on, and I'm going to highlight the resolution here. I'm going to input, let's say, 300 pixels. Now notice what happened in our pixel dimensions. It's gone up to 1800 by 1200, and that's simply 300 times 600, or 300 times 6 equals 1800. But notice what happened to our file size here. It's gone from 395.5K all the way up to 6.18 megabytes. So we are inventing information now. We're basically telling Photoshop, okay, I want you to look at the surrounding pixels of this image and increase that. I want you to pump in more information. Now notice what happens when I click OK. It's gone up considerably, but look at the quality of our photo. Let me go and double click my zoom tool and we'll get this to 100%. You'll notice that we get a little bit of degraded quality here. We're getting some pixelation, and that's because we've invented pixels here. We've told Photoshop to put in information. When you take out pixels, as we did a moment ago, you're not necessarily degrading the quality of your photo, you're just making it smaller. But by putting in that information, we are degrading the quality of our photo. So you want to be very careful about increasing the size of your documents when you're messing around with the resolution. Now, one more thing I want to talk about. We go back to this big file. If you go and create a new document, let's say you've opened this photo, but you want to drag it into a working design that you're currently working in. Let's go to File, New, and create a new document. So what I want to do is I want to create, let's just say, an 8 by 10. We'll do an 8 or 10 inches wide by 8 inches high. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 100 pixels per inch. RGB color space, 8 bits per channel. White background. Let's go ahead and click OK. So I'm going to go back to this document. I want to drag and drop this one into my new file. So I'm going to drag it up to the name here and just release. Now notice what happens. We don't see the entire image. If I click and drag around here, you can see it's considerably larger than the dimensions of this current file. That's because it's still at this current resolution at 1700 by 1129. But it's sitting inside of this much smaller dimension file. So if I zoom out and I want to scale it in there, I'm just going to press Command or Control T, or you can simply go into the Edit menu and go to Transform, and we'll do Scale. There you can see that this is the current size of my document. The viewable area, however, is considerably smaller, so you can just scale it down. This would be the case in many instances if you're working with digital photographs that are coming from a digital camera. Sometimes they come in at considerably higher dimensions and relatively low resolutions. Some digital cameras will give you like a 40 by 30 inch at 72 dpi. Remember what I said earlier, if you drop those dimensions, you increase your resolution. So if you took that and dropped it down to an 8 by 10, with the resampling checked off, you would get your higher resolution file. So, a couple things to keep in mind. Now, I just want to mention one last thing about color spacing. Color spaces, if you go into the image menu, and your first item here is called Mode. And you'll notice that we've got a number of different color spaces to work in. Now, RGB is going to be the most common because this represents transmitted light in a sense. Your monitor is displaying your colors with red, green, and blue light, and that's the current color space right now, which is RGB. This will not only show you the widest color gamut of your photo, but it also makes all the other tools inside Photoshop fully available. Now, if I go in here and switch this to CMYK, and CMYK is a print color mode, and what it does, CMYK does have a much smaller, let's go ahead and look okay. CMYK does have a much smaller color gamut, means it can only achieve fewer colors. Not only that, inside Photoshop, you'll notice that a number of filters and items are grayed out, making it not possible to apply these in this current color space. So it's very limited, and you would really only want to convert to CMYK right at the moment you're going to start printing. So working in RGB is going to give you the most flexibility and the most features available to you. And of course, other color modes are grayscale, which of course is simply just black, white, and gray tones. Other color spaces that are a little less common, index color is a web format. If you're a web designer, you are much familiar with this color space. LAB and multi-channel are also very specialized color spaces, but you're going to find that the most common color spaces you're going to use are going to be RGB probably 95% of the time, CMYK and grayscale. Okay, so in this lesson we're going to talk about cropping your images inside Photoshop. Now, two of the most common reasons to crop a photo are, one, to remove unwanted elements. Perhaps you took a photo and maybe on the side there's an element or a person standing there that you didn't necessarily want in there. So you could crop your image down and go ahead and remove that. Another reason is to create perhaps a more appealing composition. Or you perhaps want to focus your attention on a particular aspect of your photo, and you can do that by cropping it. Now, using the crop tool, let's go into the toolbar, and you'll notice right down here it's got the crop tool. And what you do is you simply just click and drag, and you notice I can freely draw any size box here that I want. And once you release the mouse, it's going to give you the crop window with all these transform handles all around. You can grab any one of these. If you grab the top handle, you can certainly drag it up and down and resize it horizontally. Grab the vertical handle and increase or decrease the size this way. You can also grab any of the corner handles and freely modify the entire box like this. Now notice when we drew the box, the rest of the image, or the outer area of the crop box, darkened. And that's because of this right up in here. If you look in the options bar, you'll notice we've got a shield. And that's what it's called. You can simply uncheck that if you like. But what it does is it's a visual aid to help you decide how you're going to image, or give you a better preview of how your image is going to look after it's cropped. And it is at 75% opacity, so you can faintly see your image through there. You can certainly take it all the way up, so you can really get a good idea of what your image is going to look like cropped. But it's probably a good idea to see a little bit of your image, just so you can tell right away if there's a part that you're cropping out that you don't necessarily want to, and you can just resize the box accordingly. Now, once you have dragged your box over an area you want to crop in, you simply press the Enter key, and it will go ahead and crop your photo based on that selection. But notice, I'm going to go ahead and undo this. Let's go into the Edit menu and go do Undo Crop. Now, before we do this, I'm going to go into the Image menu and go to Image Size, and you'll notice what we have here is a 12 by 8 inch at a resolution at 150 pixels per inch. And when I go and make a crop, let's go and grab that crop tool again. I'm just going to drag a box out, and I'm going to press Enter. So let's go into that Image Size menu and see what happened. You'll notice that the dimensions have dropped according to our crop settings, but the resolution has stayed the same. So what it did is basically narrowed the dimensions, throwing out all that extra information, but still keeping the same resolution of this file. So that's one way of doing it. Go to let's go to undo that. Go to Edit, Undo Crop. Now another way of applying a crop is by doing it from within the options bar. Let's say you've got a very specific size that you want to crop an image to. You can do that by entering your dimensions inside of here. So let's say if we're looking at, as we saw earlier, a 12 by 8, let's say I want to make it roughly half that. I want to make it 6 by 4. Well, we can go in here and enter a width of 6, and we'll enter a height of 4. And we can also input a resolution if we want to change that resolution. So I'm going to go ahead and, let's say I'm going to crop this for the web. So I'm going to go ahead and make it 72 dpi or ppi. And when we go in here and drag, you'll notice that it's keeping that proportion, right, like that. So no matter what I size this to, so notice in here, if my box appears to be just very, very small, if we look at the ruler here, it's roughly 2 inches. That doesn't mean that's what the crop is going to be when I apply it. When I press Enter, you'll notice what happened. If we go into the image size, it has now basically resized that document and resampled it to the 6 by 4 at 72 dpi that we wanted. So, makes no difference what size I drag this image to be. I just decide on an area I want to be that particular size, and it will go ahead and make it. There you see that. Gives me the cropped image, but it's still the same size that we wanted it to be. Now let's say you wanted to crop your image based on the actual dimensions of your file. Like we said, we got a 12 by 8, 150 pixels per inch. We want to keep that size, but still crop it in. So what we do is we're going to click this button right here called Front Image. And it's going to take that information and input it right in here, 12 by 8 and 150. So no matter what area I drag to size, you'll notice, and I'm just dragging the mouse all over the place, but it's still keeping in that proportion. So let's say I drag an area out, And we'll just kind of cover this area here. And you'll notice I did earlier, I can drag any one of the handles, but notice my middle handles are gone. That's because we're keeping in proportion to that size we input. But you can also rotate it. If you click right outside here, you get a little bent arrow. So we can rotate that composition, and it might give us a little bit more interesting or dramatic image there. So let's go over here and take that and put it right about there. And when I press enter, we're going to get the same size document. If we go under image size, you'll notice that we're still in the 12 by 8, 150, but it's basically narrowed that area. But what happened was we cropped that area, and then it resampled it up to fit in that designated size, or that specific size that we set up. So it's resampled it. It basically invented pixels in there. So as if you remember, I was talking about in the resolution and image size in the previous lesson, it invents those pixels. So when you're doing this, if you're going to use this front image, do be careful about how big of a crop you make or how small of a crop you make, because it's going to invent pixels. Now, one more thing I want to touch on is the process of resizing or scaling your objects inside Photoshop. Now, here I have a file of an apple. You can see it's on its own layer against a transparent background. Now, let's say I wanted to scale this object. Well, I can do that a number of different ways. I'm going to go under the Edit menu and go down here to Transform, and I'm going to choose Scale. And it's going to give me the transform box, or the free transform box in here, and I can simply grab any one of these corner handles and just resize the object accordingly. But you'll notice it doesn't do it proportionately. So if I go over here and undo that, in order to scale something proportionally, you just simply add the Shift key when you're dragging those handles, and it will keep it in proportion, as you can see as I'm scaling it. And there are a number of other features here as well you can access by going into the Edit menu. Another quick way of getting to these transform features is holding down the Control key, or simply right-clicking right on that element when it's selected, and you'll get all those other features as well. So we can also rotate the object, just like that. You can also distort it, skew it actually. Just by grabbing any one of these handles, you can skew it in either direction you want, just like that. Simple act of skewing. You can do perspective, or distort rather, allows you to basically freely transform any one of the corner handles to do whatever kind of transformation you will need. And of course there is the perspective, which gives you a perspective depending on which way you push any of the corner handles. So it's a good way of resizing images that you're going to put on the side of a building or something like that. And perhaps one of my favorite features, and that is the warp. And this puts a grid on your object, and it allows you to basically freely transform the object and do all kinds of weird things with it. This has been used for a retouching tool. You can achieve very interesting effects with this, but you can grab any of the corner handles or any of these handles here and manipulate the object around, clicking inside the grid and manipulating it. All of that works just as well. And you can, of course, rotate it 180 degrees clockwise. You can flip it horizontally or flip it vertically. Just do all these transformations while you're in that transform area. Now, one quick way I get to all of these features is if you press Command or Control T with the object or with the layer selected, you'll get the free transform box, and you can grab any of these handles and scale it and do whatever you like. But you can also move outside the area of the box, and you notice we get the rotate handles. So you don't have to go and select the rotate, you just move out and you can modify it any way you want. If you hold down the Command key, you can go into the distort mode and grab any of these handles and distort this feature. So a lot of these features are available right on the fly just simply using these keyboard shortcuts. So that is how you go about resizing objects inside Photoshop. In the next lesson, we're going to jump in and talk about how to generate selections of objects.